I did not raise my voice, not once. And I think that's what frightened them the most. My name is Gerald. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years building a civil engineering consulting firm in Calgary. The kind of company that doesn't have a flashy website or run commercials during hockey games, but whose name appears on the structural assessments of half the commercial buildings downtown. I started it with a used drafting table, a second-hand truck, and a client list of exactly one. When I sold my majority stake 4 years ago, I kept a quiet 30% and walked away with enough to live comfortably for 3 lifetimes. I didn't tell my son how much. I told him it was enough to be comfortable. That was my first mistake, letting him fill in the blank himself. My son's name is Nathan. He's 34. He got my jawline and his mother's eyes. And somewhere along the way he also got the idea that my money was a resource he could plan around. His mother, my wife Patricia, passed away from a brain aneurysm 11 years ago. She was 52. There is not a single morning I don't think about her. Nathan was young when she died, 23, and I think losing her did something to him that neither of us ever properly dealt with. I blamed myself for years. Maybe that's why I let things go on as long as I did. His wife's name is Simone. They married 3 years ago. I will tell you everything about Simone, but I want you to understand something first. I did not dislike her because she was a daughter-in-law. I disliked her because of what she did, and more importantly, because of what she turned my son into. They met at a conference in Vancouver. She was charming the way some people are charming, completely, effortlessly, and with clear intention. By their second date, she knew Nathan's approximate inheritance. I found this out much later, from a conversation Nathan didn't realize I'd heard. She'd asked him directly. He'd laughed and said he didn't know exactly. She'd said, "But your dad's loaded, right?" He'd laughed again. I remember standing in the hallway of my house that Christmas, holding 2 mugs of coffee, listening through a door that was open just 2 inches. I didn't say anything. I closed my eyes, breathed, and walked back into the kitchen. That was 18 months before the wedding. I paid for a large portion of the wedding. I offered, genuinely, because I wanted Nathan to have a beautiful day, and because Patricia would have wanted that. The reception was at a venue in Canmore, which Simone had chosen, and which cost what I used to pay a junior engineer for a full year. I wrote the check without blinking. I hugged my son at the altar and told him I loved him. I meant it with everything I had. The trouble started 4 months after the wedding. It began with small things. Simone would mention casually over Sunday dinners that the condo they were renting in Beltline was getting cramped, that the neighborhood wasn't ideal for starting a family, that property values in Calgary were only going to keep climbing. These weren't conversations. They were presentations, carefully structured with an ask folded into the middle. Then Nathan started calling more often, not to talk about his life, not to ask about mine, to talk about real estate. Did I know what a semi-detached in outer door was going for now? Had I thought about what I was going to do with the house long term? The house. My house, the one Patricia and I bought in 1991 in a quiet crescent in Lakeview, the one I refinished the hardwood floors in myself, the one where Nathan took his first steps and lost his first tooth and cried in the kitchen the night his mother died. One evening in March, he sat across from me at my own kitchen table and said, "Dad, it makes more financial sense for us to have the house. You'd be more comfortable in something smaller. We could help manage the transition." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I asked him if he wanted more coffee. He took that as encouragement. The conversations became more frequent, more direct. Simone began accompanying him to these Sunday visits, which had previously been just the 2 of us. She would sit with her hands folded and say things like, "Gerald, it's just about being practical, and you'd have so much less to worry about in a condo." She had a way of framing my own life as a burden I needed help relieving. I want to tell you something about myself. I am not a man who shows his hand early. I spent 3 decades negotiating infrastructure contracts with municipal governments and provincial ministries. I know how to sit across a table from someone who wants something from me and give them nothing. No confirmation, No denial, no signal, while I figure out exactly what they're doing and why. I learned this from my father, who was a quiet man from Lethbridge, who always said, "The person who talks the most in a negotiation loses the most." So I listened. I nodded. I said things like, "I'll think about it," and "That's an interesting point." And meanwhile, I made a phone call. His name is Warren. He's been my lawyer since 1997. He handled the sale of my firm, he handled Patricia's estate, and he has a memory like a municipal archive. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting and then said, "Gerald, how much does Nathan know about the trust?" The trust. Let me explain. When I sold the majority stake in my firm, on Warren's advice, I placed the proceeds, along with the deed to my house and a small commercial property I own in Red Deer, into a discretionary family trust. My name is the trustee. My name is the trustee. My name is also the primary beneficiary during my lifetime. Nathan is a secondary beneficiary, which means he inherits what remains after I'm gone. But he has no access, no authority, and no claim while I'm alive. Not a dollar, not a square foot. The house is not in my name. It's in the trust's name. Simone could research property records until her eyes crossed, and she would find nothing registered to Gerald Allen Whitmore. Nathan did not know about the trust. I had never told him because I had never needed to, and because Warren had advised keeping the structure private until relevant. It had never been relevant. Until now. I told Warren it was time to make sure everything was properly documented. He said he'd have updated paperwork ready within the week. I thanked him and hung up, and then I sat in Patricia's chair by the window, the wingback she used to read in, and I looked out at the backyard, at the crabapple tree we planted the year Nathan was born, and I felt a sadness so deep and so specific that it didn't have a name. The visit that changed everything happened on a Sunday in late April. Nathan arrived with Simone and, unexpectedly, with a folder. Inside the folder was a document. It was a property transfer agreement, a legal instrument for transferring the title of my home from my name to theirs, in exchange for what the document described as fair market value to be negotiated in good faith. The amount listed as an initial offer was 60% of the current assessed value. My house, which backs onto a ravine and sits on one of the best lots in Lakeview, assessed at $1.4 million by the city of Calgary that year. They were offering to buy it from me for $840,000. Not in cash, in a private mortgage agreement, meaning they would pay me monthly installments. Meaning I would become their creditor. Meaning, if they stopped paying, I'd spend years in court trying to reclaim my own home. I picked up the document. I read the first page. I read the second page. I set it face down on the table. Simone said, "We've had a lawyer look at it." I said, "Which lawyer?" She named someone I had never heard of. "A real estate lawyer with an office in the Northeast." I nodded. Nathan said, "Dad, this is just a starting point. We can talk about the numbers." I said, "Where would I live?" Simone said there were several excellent independent living options in the Southwest, and that they'd already looked at a few on my behalf. She slid a second folder across the table. Inside were printed pages from 3 different websites. Senior apartment complexes, one in Aspen Woods, one near Heritage Drive, one in Shaughnessy. They had circled units in pen. Units with 1 bedroom. Units with, as one brochure cheerfully described it, on-site wellness programming. I was 68 years old. I had no mobility issues, no cognitive concerns, no medical conditions beyond slightly elevated cholesterol for which I took a single daily pill. I coached a junior engineering mentorship program at the University of Calgary. I drove myself everywhere. I cooked my own meals. I had more energy than Nathan on most days. I looked at the brochures. I looked at my son. He had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable. Simone did not. She said, "Gerald, be reasonable. The house is too big for one person. Nathan and I are planning to start a family. This is just the next logical step." I put the brochures back in the folder. I folded my hands on the table, and then I said very quietly, "I'd like you both to leave now." Nathan said, "Dad?" I said, "Nathan, I love you. I would like you to leave my house." The drive out of the driveway that afternoon, I watched from the window, took less than a minute. What they left behind took considerably longer to deal with. I called Warren the next morning. Then I called my accountant, a woman named Joyce, who has managed my personal finances for 12 years, and who reacted to my summary of the previous day's visit with a silence that told me she was choosing her words very carefully. Then I called the one person I had not spoken to in almost a year. My brother-in-law, Patricia's younger brother, a retired RCMP officer named Frank, who lives outside Cochrane, and who has, in his quiet way, been one of the most steadying forces in my life since Patricia died. Frank listened to the whole story. Then he said, "What do you need?" I told him I needed to know if what Simone and Nathan had done, preparing that document, researching those facilities, presenting it to me as though it were already a done deal, was legal. Frank said he'd look into it. Then he said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "Gerald, the mistake people make in situations like this is they think anger is the answer. It isn't. Clarity is the answer. Get clear, get documented, and get ahead of them. That's all. Get ahead of them. That's all. Get ahead of them." In the weeks that followed, I did several things that I want to describe carefully, because each of them mattered. First, I had Warren formally document the trust structure with additional safeguards, specifically a provision that required any request related to trust assets to be submitted in writing to the trustee, reviewed by independent counsel, and approved by a 2/3 agreement of a 3-person advisory committee I established, composed of Warren, Joyce, and a retired judge named Patrick, whom Warren knew through the Calgary Bar Association. Any attempt to challenge or transfer trust assets without this process would trigger an automatic legal review. Warren said it was, structurally speaking, one of the more elegant setups he'd seen. I thanked him and told him to send the invoice to the trust. Second, I had a quiet conversation with Nathan's employer, his firm, where he worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction company, not to interfere with his career, but to understand, through a mutual contact, whether he had recently taken out any loans or made any significant financial commitments. The answer came back within a week. Nathan and Simone had pre-approved themselves for a mortgage significantly larger than their combined income would conventionally support. They had been counting on my house, on their expectation of my house, as the collateral or cash infusion that would make the math work. They had already made commitments based on money they didn't have, from a house that was never theirs to count on. Third, and this is the part I thought about the longest before doing, I called Nathan. Not to confront him, not to accuse him. I called him and I asked if he wanted to come for dinner the following Sunday, just the two of us. He sounded surprised. He said yes. He came on a Sunday evening in late May. I made the same meal his mother used to make, mustard-glazed pork tenderloin, roasted carrots, and biscuits from a recipe Patricia had written on an index card that still lived in the same kitchen drawer. I opened a bottle of red wine. We sat at the same table. For the first hour, we talked about hockey, about the project he was managing near Airdrie, about a fishing trip I was planning with Frank in July. It felt almost normal. It felt like what Sundays used to feel like. Then I put down my fork and I said, "I want to talk about what happened in April." Nathan's jaw tightened. He started to say something and I held up one hand, not sharply, just a quiet signal, and he stopped. I said, "I'm not angry. I want you to hear that first. I am not angry, but I need you to understand some things, and I need to say them once, clearly, and then we don't have to speak about them again." I told him about the trust. I told him that the house had never been registered in my personal name, that it had been held in a discretionary trust for nearly 4 years, and that no transfer of any trust asset was possible without a formal process involving 3 independent advisors, none of whom were family. I told him that the document he and Simone had brought to my table had no legal force, and never could have had any legal force, and that if they had paid a lawyer to draft it, they had paid a lawyer who had either not done their due diligence or not been given accurate information. Nathan went very still. I said, "I also want you to know that I am aware of the mortgage pre-approval. I am aware of what you were counting on." He looked at the table. He said, very quietly, "Dad," she said. I said, "I know what she said. But you're my son, not hers." There was a long silence. Outside, the crabapple tree was in bloom, late that year because of a cold spring. And through the kitchen window the light was that particular Mayan Calgary gold that only lasts about 20 minutes before it goes blue. Nathan said, "I don't know what I was thinking." I said, "I think you were scared. And I think you let someone else's plan become your plan. And I think somewhere in there you forgot who I was." He put his head in his hands. He didn't cry, not quite. But his voice cracked when he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm genuinely sorry." I told him I believed him. I told him that what happened next, in his marriage with Simone, with the mortgage they'd overextended themselves on, was his to figure out, and that I would not be solving those problems for him, but that I would not abandon him either. I told him he was my son, and that his mother had loved him more than anything in the world, and that I carried that love forward every single day on her behalf as much as my own. He stayed until almost midnight. We finished the wine. We did the dishes together like we used to when he was a teenager, him washing and me drying, and he told me about a conversation he'd had with Simone 3 days earlier, an argument, serious, about the pre-approval, about what she'd expected from my house, about what she'd told her own parents. He didn't ask for my advice. I didn't give any. I just dried the plates and listened. In the months that followed, Nathan and Simone went through a difficult stretch. I knew this not from Nathan, who kept most of it private, but from Frank, who had stayed in loose contact with Nathan. They did not separate. Whether they should have was never mine to decide. What I can tell you is that Simone never came to my house for Sunday dinner again, and that she never contacted me directly about the property or the trust or anything financial ever again. Warren sent me a summary letter in September confirming that all trust documents were updated, all provisions were in force, and that he had received no legal correspondence from any outside party challenging the structure. I went fishing with Frank in July. We caught 2 walleye and 1 impressive northern pike, and we drank a thermos of coffee on a dock at sunrise and barely said 30 words the whole morning, and I think that was one of the best days I've had in a long time. Nathan came for Christmas. Just him. We sat in the living room, in the same house, with the same hardwood floors I'd refinished, under the same roof Patricia had chosen when we were 32 years old, and had no idea what life was going to cost us. And we ate well, and watched the game, and stayed up too late. And when he left, he hugged me for a long time and didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I thought about my father's voice when I was driving him to the airport. The person who talks the most in a negotiation loses the most. I had not raised my voice once through the entire thing, not when they brought the folder, not when I saw the brochures for the senior apartments, not when Nathan sat at my table with his head in his hands. I had stayed quiet, gotten clear, gotten documented, and gotten ahead of them. I'm still in my house. The crabapple tree bloomed again in the spring, right on schedule, and I've learned one thing I want to share with anyone who might recognize themselves in this story. Do not assume that love protects your assets, and do not assume that keeping the peace means letting people mistake your silence for agreement. Silence, done right, is not passive. Silence, done right, is architecture. You build something with it, you make it load-bearing. And when the moment comes, not to win, not to punish, but just to be clear, the structure holds. Mine did. I keep thinking about that kitchen table. Not the document on it, not the folder Simone had prepared so carefully, not even the look on Nathan's face when he realized what he'd walked into my house to do. I keep thinking about the table itself. The one Patricia and I bought at a second-hand shop on 17th Avenue the year we moved into that house. The one that has a small burn mark near the far corner from a candle that tipped over at Christmas 1998. The one where Nathan did homework and ate cereal and learned to play cribbage. That's the table they chose to put their transfer documents on. I don't think they thought about that. I don't think they saw it at all. What happened to us? And I say us because it was never just about me. It was about Nathan too. About what he almost became. Came down to a very simple chain of cause and consequence. Simone wanted something. Nathan wanted to give her what she wanted because that's what people do when they're trying to hold a marriage together, and they don't yet have the steadiness to know where their own line is. and I'd spent years being quietly generous in ways that communicated without my intending it, that my resources were available, that what I had was somehow also theirs to count on. Every check I wrote, every bill I quietly absorbed, every time I said don't worry about it, I was, without knowing it, writing a story they eventually believed. That's the consequence side. But consequence only arrives after cause. And the cause, the part I sat with the longest, was the gradual erosion of something I should have protected much earlier. Not the house, not the trust. My son's sense of what was right. I watched it soften over 3 years, and I told myself it was just the new relationship, just the adjustment, just a phase. I kept the peace when I should have been honest. Keeping the peace, I've learned, is not the same thing as being kind. Sometimes it's the least kind thing you can do. What got me through it wasn't rage, and it wasn't strategy, not really. What got me through it was a kind of quiet integrity. The decision, made early and held firmly, that I was not going to become bitter, not going to retaliate, not going to make Nathan choose between his father and his wife in any ugly public way. I was going to handle it correctly, not for my own pride. Because it was the right thing to do, and because I genuinely knew that Nathan was still in there somewhere. The kid who washed dishes beside me and asked questions about bridges and cried in the kitchen when his mother died. That version of my son was worth protecting even when he wasn't protecting himself. The intelligence part. And I don't mean cleverness, I mean the kind of clear-headed thinking that Frank described as get ahead of them. That part came from years of sitting across from difficult people and not flinching. You cannot think clearly when you are performing anger. You cannot build anything solid when your hands are shaking. I had to get quiet before I could get smart, and getting smart meant understanding exactly what was happening before I responded to any of it. Warren's trust structure didn't save my house. The decision to think before I reacted saved everything else. And then there's the third part, the part that doesn't get talked about enough, which is just endurance. The willingness to sit with discomfort for months without resolving it prematurely, to have Nathan in my home for Sunday dinner and not bring up what was happening, to wait for the right moment instead of the satisfying one. That kind of patience isn't passive. It is, I'd argue, the hardest thing a person can do. It requires you to trust yourself enough to not need immediate relief. Nathan and I still have Sunday dinners, not every week, but enough. The crabapple tree Patricia and I planted bloomed again this spring, right on time, same as it always has. Some things, if you take care of them properly, simply keep going.